Blood doesn't always roar in your ears. Sometimes it just freezes. Ethan Cole stopped breathing when Marcus Webb's damp hand slid down his spine, the heat of his breath, reeking of stale coffee and that cloying, desperate alpha cologne, ghosting across the back of his neck. Ethan's body went rigid, every instinct screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. But he'd learned long ago that survival meant staying very, very still. He calculated the cost. His paycheck, his younger brother's medical bills, the rent, the utility bills that were 3 months overdue, against his dignity. The dignity lost, same as every other time. Then came the quiet scrape of a leather shoe against the linoleum. Ethan's breath caught, not from Marcus, from the figure standing in the doorway of the bullpen, backlit by the sickly neon buzz of the Northside Logistics sign outside. The sign cast its intermittent red glow over Ethan's cluttered desk, stacks of shipping manifests, unpaid invoices, and a half-empty mug of cold green tea. Leo Costello stood in the doorway. He didn't pull a gun. He didn't yell. He didn't even move. He just looked at Marcus Webb with eyes like dead pavement, whispering a promise of absolute ruin without opening his mouth. The scent hit Ethan a second later. Something dark and cold, like ozone before a lightning strike, cut through with the clean sharpness of expensive soap, and something deeper, something that made Ethan's hindbrain sit up and pay attention. Alpha, a powerful one. The kind that didn't need to posture or preen because everyone in a 50-foot radius already knew exactly what he was. Ethan had been around enough alphas to know the difference between the ones who strutted and the ones who simply were. Marcus was the former. Leo Costello was very much the latter. Ethan Cole lived his life in a state of perpetual low-grade exhaustion. He was 29, but his bones felt ancient. Survival in a city that bled you dry for rent and groceries didn't leave room for youthful exuberance, especially when you were an Omega trying to make it on your own. He worked as the senior logistics coordinator at Northside, a fancy title for the person who fixed everyone else's mistakes for barely above minimum wage. He stayed because he had a younger brother, Danny, in a residential care facility across town, and Northside offered a halfway decent health insurance plan. That insurance came with a heavy, suffocating tax. His name was Marcus Webb. Marcus was the regional manager, an alpha in his late 40s, composed entirely of soft edges and sharp malice. He wore suits that were a fraction too tight and drowned himself in cologne that smelled like synthetic pine and desperation. He was the kind of alpha who'd never explicitly crossed a line in front of HR, but lived his life firmly planted on its boundary. He liked to hover, to loom, to remind Ethan exactly how vulnerable he was. Looking a little tired today, Ethan. Marcus's voice came from directly behind Ethan's chair. He'd appeared without warning, which was a trick he'd perfected. Ethan didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that flinching gave Marcus a thrill. Just going through end-of-month discrepancies. You work too hard. Marcus leaned over, bracing one hand on Ethan's desk and the other on the back of his chair, effectively boxing him in. The smell of his cologne was overpowering. You need to learn to relax. Maybe I could buy you a drink after we wrap up the Miller account. Ethan kept his eyes locked on his monitor, watching the numbers blur together. I have to visit my brother, he said, his voice flat. Monotone. Empty. Your brother can wait. Marcus's hand drifted to Ethan's shoulder, his thumb pressing into the muscle just below Ethan's scent gland. A calculated touch. Plausible deniability. Just a friendly pat between coworkers. Except it wasn't, and they both knew it. Ethan's hindbrain was screaming at him. Submit. Submit. Submit or he'll. But he didn't submit. He held himself rigid, refusing to give Marcus the satisfaction. Keep at it then. Marcus's hand lingered a beat too long before he pulled away, finally retreating to his corner office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. Ethan exhaled only when the door was fully closed. He rubbed his shoulder as if he could physically wipe away the sensation of Marcus's hand. A daily routine. A cynical dance of endurance. He pressed his palm against his own scent gland, feeling the faint vibration of his suppressed distress. He wore scent blockers every day, religiously, covering the fact that he was an omega in a workplace full of alphas who'd see that as an invitation. The blockers made him smell like nothing. Neutral. Safe. Invisible. That was the reality of his world. You swallow the pill. You do the work. You pay the bills. No one was coming to save him. Until Thursday. Thursday was the day the silent partners came in to audit the books. Northside Logistics was a legitimate business. Mostly. But even the lowest-level clerks knew it washed money for people you didn't look at too closely. Ethan didn't ask questions. Ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was job security. Leo Costello was one of those people. The first time Ethan saw him, he'd been struck by how quiet the alpha was. Leo didn't swagger. He didn't wear flashy jewelry or suits that screamed his net worth. He dressed in charcoal and midnight blue. Clothes tailored so perfectly they looked like they'd been woven directly onto his frame. He had dark hair perpetually shadowing a face carved out of granite, a face that looked like it had been left out in the cold for a few decades. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Impossible to tell. He moved with terrifying stillness. Where Marcus took up space with noise and sweat, Leo consumed the air in a room simply by existing in it. Ethan felt it the first time Leo passed his desk, a prickle at the base of his skull, a warning from his hindbrain that something powerful was nearby. But Leo didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him. He walked straight to Marcus's office, stayed for an hour, and left. But lately, things had shifted. It started 3 weeks ago. Ethan had been working through his lunch break, gnawing on a stale granola bar, when a heavy ceramic mug slid onto his desk. Steam curled up from the dark liquid. Ethan looked up, startled. Leo was standing there, his hands resting in the pockets of his slacks. He'd come up so silently Ethan hadn't even heard him. "Black tea," Leo said. His voice was a low rumble, rough around the edges like tires on loose gravel. "You don't drink the coffee here." "Smart. It tastes like battery acid." Ethan stared at the mug. Thank you, Mr. Costello." "Leo," he corrected quietly. His eyes, pale, piercing gray, swept over Ethan's desk, lingering for a fraction of a second on the framed photo of Danny. Then they moved back to Ethan. He didn't smile. He didn't leer. He just observed with an intensity that made the hair on Ethan's arm stand up. "Take a break, Ethan. The freight will still be here in 10 minutes. He walked away before Ethan could formulate a response. Since then, it became a quiet routine. A nod in the hallway. A delivered cup of tea. Once, Leo paused by the copy machine to silently unjam it for Ethan, his large, scarred hands working the plastic levers with surprising gentleness. He never asked for anything. He never lingered too long. But Ethan could feel his eyes on him sometimes, a heavy, anchoring weight that wasn't unpleasant exactly, just present. Ethan told himself not to read into it. Alphas like Leo Costello didn't notice omegas like Ethan Cole unless there was an angle. He was a cynical man by necessity. Fairy tales were for people who didn't have past due medical bills. But as the days grew shorter and the Boston winter began to bite, Ethan found himself looking up at the door every Thursday, waiting for the quiet click of Leo's shoes on the tile. It was a Tuesday night, pushing past 8 o'clock. The rest of the office had emptied out hours ago, leaving behind a profound, hollow silence broken only by the rhythmic drumming of freezing rain against the single-pane windows. Ethan was trapped in the quarterly financial reports, the numbers bleeding together on the screen. His neck ached, a sharp knot of tension coiled tight at the base of his skull. He typed in the final sequence of digits, hit save, and let his head fall back against his chair, closing his eyes. Still here, Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. He snapped his eyes open. Marcus was standing at the edge of his cubicle. His tie was loosened, his collar unbuttoned, and his eyes had a glassy, unfocused sheen. He'd been drinking, the sharp tang of whiskey cut through his usual pine cologne. "Just finishing up," Ethan said, his voice tight. He immediately reached for his bag on the floor, abandoning the idea of double-checking his work. "I'm heading out now." Hold on. What's the rush? Marcus stepped into the cubicle. It was a small space. Too small for two people. Too small for a drunk alpha with bad intentions. My brother. Ethan lied smoothly, standing. He needs a call before lights out. He can wait 5 minutes. Marcus didn't move out of the way. He stood dead center in the narrow opening, blocking Ethan's path. You've been working so hard, Ethan. I see it. I appreciate it. You know I appreciate it, right? Thank you, Marcus. Excuse me. Ethan tried to step past him. Marcus shifted his weight, blocking him. The sickening smile on his face widened. I feel like we don't connect. Not really. I try to be a good boss. I try to be a friend. But you're always so cold. I prefer to keep things professional. Ethan kept his voice even, suppressing the rising tide of panic. His omega instincts were screaming at him to run, to bare his throat, to do something to appease the aggressive alpha in front of him. But he fought it. He gripped the strap of his bag until his knuckles turned white. Professional, Marcus mocked softly. He took a half step closer. Ethan hit the edge of his desk. There was nowhere left to back up. Professional is boring. You're too pretty to be boring, Ethan. He reached out. Ethan turned his head sharply, but Marcus didn't go for his face. His heavy, damp hand clamped down on Ethan's shoulder, his thumb pressing hard into the muscle just above the scent gland. The touch was possessive, bruising. He leaned in, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against Ethan's cheek. Just relax, he whispered, his other hand coming up to rest on Ethan's hip. Ethan's mind screamed. The cynical survivalist part of his brain was shutting down, rapidly being replaced by raw, primal fight-or-flight instinct. He opened his mouth to tell Marcus to back the hell off. Consequences be damned. A heavy metallic click echoed through the empty office floor. It was the sound of the main entry door locking. Marcus froze. He didn't let go of Ethan, but his head snapped toward the corridor. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, entirely unhurried. The unmistakable sound of leather-soled shoes on cheap linoleum. Ethan felt a bizarre, icy calm wash over him. He knew that footstep. Leo rounded the corner of the cubicle bank. He was wearing a black trench coat over a dark suit, his shoulders dusted with melting snow. He stopped 10 feet away. The silence that descended on the room was absolute. A physical pressure, heavy and suffocating. Leo didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at Ethan's face. His pale gray eyes were locked onto the exact spot where Marcus's hand was gripping Ethan's hip. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Costello. Marcus's voice was high and reedy. The alcohol-induced bravado vanished. He dropped his hands from Ethan as if his skin had suddenly caught fire. I didn't know you were coming in tonight. The quarterly review isn't until Thursday. Leo slowly raised his eyes from Ethan's hip to Marcus's face. The expression on his face was utterly blank. No anger. No rage. Only a terrifying, hollow emptiness that promised violence. I forgot my ledger, Leo said. His voice was a whisper. Soft and deadly calm. I can go get it for you. Marcus took a step away from Ethan, desperate to put distance between himself and the other alpha. Leo didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a dark monolith in the flickering fluorescent light. He finally looked at Ethan. His eyes swept over Ethan's pale face, the tense line of his jaw, the way he was clutching his bag against his chest like a shield. Something dark and terrible fractured the ice in Leo's gaze. A momentary slip, a flash of something so violent and possessive that Ethan felt his breath hitch in his throat. Leo turned his attention back to Marcus. You're in my way. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to force a chuckle, but it came out like a wet cough. Right? Sorry, Mr. Costello. Just going over some late numbers with Ethan here. Dedicated worker, you know. He took a step out of the cubicle, intending to scurry past Leo down the main aisle. He didn't make it. As Marcus drew level with him, Leo moved. It wasn't a sprawling cinematic brawl. It was a masterclass in brutal, economic violence. Leo's right hand lashed out, gripping Marcus by the throat. The momentum of the grab slammed Marcus backward into a filing cabinet with a sickening thud, the wind leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. Ethan gasped, stepping back against his desk. Leo stepped into Marcus's space, pinning him against the metal cabinet. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice a single decibel. He pressed his forearm against Marcus's windpipe, just enough to cut off the air, just enough to make the man's eyes bulge with panic. Then, with his left hand, Leo reached down and took hold of Marcus's right hand. The same hand that had just been resting on Ethan's hip. Leo gripped Marcus's fingers. He bent them backward. Marcus tried to scream, but the pressure on his throat turned the sound into a strangled, gurgling squeak. His face turned a mottled purplish red. His feet scrabbled against the carpet. "Look at me," Leo whispered. The sound carried perfectly in the dead silence of the office. Marcus rolled his terrified, watery eyes toward Leo. "I'm going to explain the reality of your situation to you," Leo said, his tone conversational, as if discussing stock prices. He increased the pressure on Marcus's hand. A sharp, wet pop echoed in the quiet space as a joint dislocated. Marcus convulsed, tears streaming down his face, choking on his own spittle. "You breathe the air I allow you to breathe," Leo murmured, leaning closer. "You sit in the chair I pay for. You run the business I own. You are nothing but a minor convenience to me. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded frantically, his eyes pleading. Leo leaned in closer, his lips inches from Marcus's ear. "If you ever touch him again, if you look at him, if you speak his name, if you even think about breathing in his direction, you're dead. I won't just kill you, Marcus. I will erase you. I will make it so painful and so drawn out that you will beg God for hell just to escape me." Leo twisted the hand another fraction of an inch. Another snap. Marcus let out a muffled whimper, his knees buckling entirely. The only thing keeping him upright was Leo's forearm against his throat. "Not if you comprehend." Marcus nodded violently. Leo held him there for 3 more agonizing seconds, letting the sheer terror marinate in the man's veins. Then he let go. Marcus collapsed onto the cheap gray carpet like a sack of wet laundry. He curled into a fetal position, cradling his ruined hand against his chest, gasping for air in ragged, pathetic sobs. Leo didn't spare him a second glance. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, and meticulously wiped his hands. He dropped the handkerchief directly onto Marcus's head. Slowly, Leo turned around to face Ethan. The silence rushed back in, broken only by Marcus's pathetic wheezing on the floor. Ethan was pressed flat against the window, his heart threatening to crack his ribs. His Omega instincts were in overdrive, every nerve ending screaming at him that he was in the presence of something dangerous, something predatory. And yet, despite all of that, he didn't feel threatened. Not by Leo. He was looking at a killer. He'd always known, abstractly, what Leo was. But seeing the casual, effortless cruelty of a man who dealt in human lives, shattered the glass wall of denial Ethan had built. He expected Leo to be angry. He expected the cold, dead look to be turned on him. Instead, as Leo looked at him, his posture softened. The terrifying tension bled out of his shoulders. He took a slow step toward Ethan, stopping respectfully at the edge of the cubicle. He didn't trap him. He left a clear path to the door. "Get your coat, Ethan," Leo said, his voice no longer the gravelly whisper of a murderer. It was calm, grounded. "I'm taking you home." Ethan's voice shook. He swallowed hard, trying to find his cynical armor, trying to find the tough, unbothered man who survived this city. He couldn't. "My car is in the lot." "Leave it," Leo said. "I'll have someone bring it to your apartment tomorrow." He looked down at Marcus, a flicker of profound disgust crossing his features. "You aren't coming back here. You'll be placed at a different firm by tomorrow afternoon. Better pay. Better hours. No garbage." Ethan stared at him, his chest heaving. "Why are you doing this?" Leo stood in the harsh, flickering light, a dangerous man in a dangerous world, looking at an exhausted Omega as if he were the only real thing left in it. Because, Leo said softly, his pale eyes holding Ethan's with unyielding gravity, you shouldn't have to freeze every time someone walks into a room. Let's go. The Boston air was a physical assault. It hit Ethan the second he pushed through the heavy glass doors, a wet, freezing slap that finally jump-started his stalled lungs. He dragged in a sharp breath, the damp cold tasting like exhaust and salt. Behind him, the door clicked shut. Leo followed him out into the sleet. A black SUV idled at the curb, not flashy, a heavy, utilitarian block of dark metal with tinted windows that absorbed the sickly yellow streetlights. As they approached, the driver's side door opened and a broad-shouldered man in a heavy wool coat stepped out. He didn't speak. He just pulled open the rear passenger door and stood aside. Ethan stopped on the pavement. The sleet was already soaking through the thin fabric of his coat, freezing his collar to his neck. He looked at the open door, then at Leo. I can take the T, he said, his voice thin. The station's only 3 blocks away. Get in the car, Ethan. It wasn't a request. It was a flat, immovable statement of fact. Ethan got in. The interior smelled of expensive leather, ozone from the heater, and faintly of Leo's clean, sharp scent. That dark, cold ozone and soap combination that made Ethan's hindbrain sit up and take notice. It was a stark contrast to the stale cigarette smoke and desperation he was used to breathing. Leo slid in beside him. The door shut behind him with a heavy, vault-like thud, severing them from the noise of the city. The driver pulled away from the curb smoothly. For 10 minutes, the silence in the car was absolute. Ethan kept his knees pressed together, staring out the window at the blurred, streaking lights of the city. His mind was a chaotic loop of the last 20 minutes. The wet crack of Marcus's fingers, the terrified gurgling sound he'd made, the total lack of emotion in Leo's eyes as he'd done it. He squeezed his eyes shut. He was 29 years old. He managed spreadsheets and argued with truckers about fuel surcharges. He didn't belong in the back of an armored SUV with a man who casually dismembered people. You're hyperventilating. Leo's voice broke the quiet. He hadn't moved, still looking straight ahead at the partition separating them from the driver, his hands resting loosely on his thighs. I'm fine. Ethan's chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid jerks. You're calculating, Leo said quietly. He turned his head, fixing those pale storm-gray eyes on Ethan. You're sitting there trying to figure out what you owe me. You're trying to figure out if you traded one predator for another. Ethan swallowed hard. The blunt honesty caught him off guard. He turned to face him, the anger of exhaustion finally cutting through his shock. Did I? Leo held his gaze. The streetlights washed over his face in rhythmic intervals, highlighting the sharp angle of his jaw and the faint pale scar that cut through his left eyebrow. If I wanted to hurt you, Ethan, you wouldn't be sitting here arguing with me. And if I wanted to touch you, I wouldn't need to corner you in a cubicle to do it. It was an arrogant statement, but it wasn't a boast. It was delivered with the same chilling certainty he'd used with Marcus. I needed that job, Ethan said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. My brother is at the Oak Creek residential facility. Leo interrupted smoothly. He requires physical therapy 3 times a week, a specialized diet, and round-the-clock monitoring for seizure activity. It costs you $8,000 a month. You were drowning. Ethan froze. The blood drained from his face. How do you know that? I own the freight company, Ethan. I own the building it operates out of. You think I don't know everything about the people who work for me? Leo reached into his inner jacket pocket. Ethan flinched slightly. Leo paused, his eyes narrowing at Ethan's reaction before slowly withdrawing a sleek silver smartphone. He tapped the screen twice. Oak Creek is paid up through the end of the year. No. Ethan shook his head violently, panic sharp and metallic flaring in his chest. No. You don't pay my bills. I don't take money from you. I want to a man like you. You don't owe me anything. Leo pocketed the phone. People like you don't do favors for free. Ethan's voice finally rose. He hated the desperation in it. He hated that Leo had stripped away his independence with a couple of screen taps. What's the angle? What do you want? Leo leaned forward, invading Ethan's space just enough to make him breath catch. He didn't touch him, but the sheer gravity of his presence pinned Ethan to the leather seat. I watched you for a year, Leo said softly. I watched you come in early, exhausted. I watched you eat cheap food so you could pay for a facility you rarely have time to visit. I watched a rat like Marcus Webb circle you because he knew you were too desperate to fight back. He stopped, his jaw clenching for a fraction of a second. I'm a man who fixes broken systems. Your life was a broken system. I fixed it. Accept it. The SUV pulled to a smooth halt. Ethan looked out the window. They were parked outside his apartment building in South Boston, the brick facade crumbling, the front security door broken for 6 months, a harsh yellow streetlight flickering violently over the trash cans. My driver will be here at 8 tomorrow morning, Leo said, leaning back into his seat, restoring the distance between them. He will take you to your new office. You'll sign the paperwork. Your salary is tripled. Your medical benefits are comprehensive. Ethan gripped the door handle. He felt entirely unmoored. The cynical worldview that had kept him safe was useless here. Why, Leo? He asked one last time, his voice cracking. Leo looked out his own window, refusing to meet Ethan's eyes. Because it offended me that you had to worry. Go inside, Ethan. Lock your door. The morning light was unforgiving. It filtered through the cheap vinyl blinds of Ethan's bedroom, casting harsh, striped shadows across the scuffed hardwood floor. Ethan sat on the edge of his mattress, fully dressed, staring at the wall. He'd slept for exactly 2 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the wet snap of Marcus's fingers. At exactly 7:55 a.m., there was a heavy, rhythmic knock on his apartment door. He walked into the living room, his steps heavy. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The same broad-shouldered driver from the night before stood in the dim hallway. He held out a familiar set of keys, Ethan's car keys, and a thick manila envelope. Mr. Cole, the driver said, his voice a deep baritone, surprisingly polite. My name is Arthur. Your vehicle has been detailed and parked in the secured lot 2 blocks over. The parking fees are covered for the year. Ethan stared at the keys dangling from Arthur's thick fingers. He took them, then accepted the envelope. Thank you, Arthur. My car is downstairs whenever you're ready. Arthur didn't wait for a reply, simply turning and heading down the creaking staircase. Ethan went back into his kitchen and sat at the wobbly Formica table. He tore open the envelope. Inside was a sleek, heavy stock folder bearing the logo of Apex Global Freight, an import-export firm operating out of the Seaport District. Legitimate. High-end. He flipped open the employment contract. Logistics director. He scanned the numbers. Leo hadn't lied. The salary was staggering. It was enough to move out of this terrible apartment. It was enough to buy Danny the specialized wheelchair he desperately needed. It was enough to actually breathe. He flipped to the signature page. At the bottom, already signed in a sharp, angular scrawl, was the name Leonardo Costello, Chief Executive Officer. Ethan traced his signature with his index finger. It felt like a trap. A beautiful, velvet-lined trap. He was trading a sleazy middle manager for a man who ruled an underworld empire, a man who broke bones with the casual indifference of someone snapping a dry twig. But as he looked around his kitchen, at the leaking faucet, the cracked linoleum, the stack of past-due utility bills sitting on the counter, the cynicism that usually protected him felt flimsy and inadequate. He grabbed his coat and walked out the door. Arthur drove him to Oak Creek first. Ethan needed to see Danny before he made a decision that would bind them both to a monster. The facility was bright, smelling of antiseptic and lavender. Ethan walked down the long corridor to room 214. Danny was sitting in a chair by the window, watching the morning traffic. He was 21, but his fragile frame and the severe contractures in his hands made him look much younger. Ethan, Danny smiled, his speech slow and deliberate. Ethan knelt beside the chair, taking his brother's twisted hands in his own. Hey, Bug. How are you feeling today? Good. The physical therapist said I'm getting stronger. Danny looked at Ethan's face, his brow furrowing. You look different. Not so tired. Ethan swallowed the knot in his throat. I got a new job, Danny. A really good one. We aren't going to have to worry about the bills anymore. Danny's eyes widened. Really? You don't have to go back to that place with the bad man. Ethan's breath hitched. He hadn't realized Danny knew about Marcus. He'd tried so hard to keep the toxicity of his life away from his brother. No. Ethan whispered, squeezing Danny's hands. I never have to go back there again. Good. Danny said firmly. I didn't like how you looked when you came from there. You looked great. Ethan stayed for an hour, feeding Danny his breakfast and brushing out his hair. When he finally walked back out to the waiting SUV, his resolve had hardened into something cold and sharp. He would take the job. He would take the money. But he would not become a possession. Arthur, Ethan said as he climbed into the back seat. Take me to Apex Global. Apex Global Freight didn't look like a front for organized crime. It occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass spire in the Seaport District, overlooking the harbor. The lobby was expansive, paved with white marble and manned by security guards in tailored suits who looked less like rent-a-cops and more like private military contractors. Ethan bypassed the reception desk, clutching the manila folder to his chest like a shield. He didn't wait to be announced. He followed the directory to the executive suite on the 32nd floor. The woman sitting outside the CEO's office was striking, efficient, and clearly expecting him. Mr. Cole, the assistant said, standing. Mr. Costello is finishing a call. You can go right in. Ethan pushed open the heavy oak doors. The office was massive, bathed in natural light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. Leo was standing behind a massive mahogany desk, phone pressed to his ear. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to expose heavy forearms corded with muscle and faintly marked by old, faded ink. He finished his conversation in rapid, fluent Italian, hung up the phone, and looked at Ethan. He didn't look surprised. He looked exactly as he had the night before, impossibly still, a quiet storm contained within a bespoke suit. Ethan walked to the center of the room and dropped the folder onto Leo's pristine desk. The smack of paper against it echoed loudly. I am not a rescue dog, Leo. Ethan's voice was steady, betraying none of the absolute terror vibrating in his chest. Leo looked down at the folder, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Ethan's. Good morning to you too, Ethan. I went to the facility. Ethan continued, refusing to let Leo derail him. I saw the balance. You paid off $100,000 in medical debt overnight. You tripled my salary. You gave me a car detail, a driver, and a job I haven't interviewed for. You're qualified. Leo walked around the desk, stopping a few feet away. He leaned his hip against the edge of the mahogany, crossing his arms over his chest. I reviewed your work at Northside. You were running that branch single-handedly while Webb drank his lunch. Apex needs a logistics director who doesn't cut corners. Stop it, Ethan snapped. Stop pretending this is just business. Men like you don't do this out of the goodness of their hearts. Leo's expression darkened slightly. The air in the room seemed to pull tight. Men like me? And what kind of man is that, Ethan? A killer. The word hung in the air, blunt and dangerous. A mobster. A criminal. I'm cynical, Leo, not stupid. I know what Northside was. I know what you are. Leo didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He just watched Ethan, his pale eyes tracking the pulse beating rapidly at the base of Ethan's throat. And yet you're standing in my office yelling at me, Leo murmured. You have a spine, Ethan. I've always admired that about you. I didn't come here for your admiration. I came here to set ground rules. Leo tilted his head, a faint, dark amusement flickering in his eyes. Ground rules? For me? Yes. For you. Ethan stepped closer, driven by a sudden reckless surge of adrenaline. I will sign the contract. I will take this job because my brother needs it, and because I refuse to go back to being a victim. I will run your logistics department flawlessly. But that is where it ends. He pointed a finger at Leo's chest. You do not own me. You did not buy me by paying off a hospital bill. I will not be your project. I will not be your pet. And I will definitely not be collateral when your real business catches up with you. If I work here, I work here. Nothing else. Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Loaded. Ethan's heart was hammering so hard, he felt lightheaded. He'd just given orders to a Mafia don. He waited for the anger. He waited for Leo to reach out and remind him exactly how dangerous he was. Instead, Leo uncrossed his arms. He reached out, his hand moving so slowly Ethan had time to pull away. But for some reason, he didn't. Leo gently caught his raised hand. His fingers were warm, rough with calluses, a stark contrast to his pristine environment. He didn't squeeze. He simply wrapped his hand around Ethan's, lowering his pointing finger. Are you finished? Leo asked softly. Ethan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Yes. Good. Leo didn't let go of Ethan's hand. He took a single half step closer, eliminating the space between them. Ethan had to tilt his head up to look at him. Up close, he could see the tiny flecks of silver in Leo's gray eyes, the exhaustion hiding in the corners. Rule number 1, Leo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that settled deep in Ethan's bones. I don't buy people. If I wanted a pet, I'd get a dog. I gave you this job because you earned it, and because leaving you in that rat trap of an office was no longer an option I was willing to tolerate. His thumb brushed lightly over Ethan's knuckles. Ethan shivered. Rule number 2, Leo continued, his gaze dropping briefly to Ethan's lips before returning to his eyes. You are not collateral. You are out of bounds to everyone in this city. No one touches you. No one looks at you sideways. You are safe here. And rule number 3? Ethan whispered, finding it difficult to draw a full breath. Leo's grip tightened just a fraction, a possessive, anchoring weight. The detached, cold persona was gone, replaced by a raw, quiet intensity that was infinitely more terrifying. Rule number 3, Leo murmured, leaning in until his breath ghosted across Ethan's cheek. Stop pretending you're not terrified. Stop pretending you have to carry the weight of the world by yourself. You fought your war, Ethan. Let me fight the rest. He released Ethan's hand and stepped back, retreating behind his desk. The sudden absence of his heat left Ethan feeling strangely cold. Your office is down the hall. Glass doors. Margaret has your access badges. Leo's tone shifted back to that smooth, detached CEO. He sat down and pulled a file toward him. We have a board meeting at noon. Be ready to present the new shipping routes. Ethan stood there for a moment, completely destabilized. He'd walked in ready for a fight, ready to defend his cynical independence. But Leo Costello hadn't fought him. He'd simply disarmed him, stepping past his armor with terrifying ease. He turned and walked toward the door. As he gripped the brass handle, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. Leo was already writing in the file, his face a mask of concentration. Ethan had laid down the law. He'd told Leo he couldn't own him. But as Ethan stepped out into the hallway and looked at the nameplate bearing his title, he couldn't shake the unsettling realization that Leo Costello didn't need to buy him. He was just going to wait for him to surrender. Ethan went by Cole now. The name on the frosted glass of his office door read E. Cole, Director of Logistics. He preferred it. The Omega who used to flinch at the sound of heavy footsteps in the Northside Logistics basement felt like a distant, fading memory. Cole was someone new. He was well-rested. His brother Danny had a state-of-the-art motorized chair and a physical therapist who actually smiled. The crushing, suffocating weight of poverty had been surgically removed from his life. It had been 6 weeks since the night the rain froze on his collar and Leo Costello rewrote his reality. Apex Global Freight was a machine. It ran on silence, precision, and an undercurrent of lethal efficiency. Cole fit into it perfectly. He didn't ask about the unmarked crates that occasionally bypassed customs in the middle of the night. He didn't ask why half the security staff carried themselves like ex-special forces. He did his job. He optimized supply chains, cut fuel waste by 14%, and completely restructured the European import routes. He survived by dealing in numbers. Numbers were safe. They didn't lie. and they didn't hold hidden agendas. Which was exactly why the numbers on Route 44 were keeping him awake at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. The Seaport District was quiet, the black waters of the harbor reflecting the scattered lights of the Boston skyline. Cole sat at his massive oak desk, his bare feet tucked under him, staring at 3 glowing monitors. Route 44 was a standard shipping lane bringing textiles from southern Italy into the port of Boston. On paper, it was flawless. But Cole had spent his entire adult life finding the lies in other people's math. He pulled up the fuel consumption logs. He cross-referenced them with the dry weight manifests and the ship's displacement drafts. A cold knot formed in his stomach. The fuel burn was wrong. A cargo ship carrying textiles didn't burn diesel at that rate unless it was fighting a massive headwind for 2 straight weeks, which the weather data proved false. Or unless the ship was sitting substantially lower in the water than the manifest claimed. Something was on those ships. Something incredibly heavy. And it wasn't on the official books. Cole didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess himself. The cynical survivalist in him knew that in a legitimate company, you flagged an anomaly to HR. In a company run by the Mafia, an anomaly meant someone was stealing from a man who broke bones for sport. He printed the logs, shoved the papers into a manila folder, and walked out of his office. The executive suite was mostly dark, save for the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. Light spilled from the gap at the bottom. 2 men stood outside. One was Thomas, the quiet, massive driver who still picked him up every morning. The other was Dominic, one of Leo's lieutenants. Dominic wore flashy suits, smiled too much, and looked at Cole like he was a stray cat Leo had dragged in out of the rain. "Mr. Cole." Thomas nodded, his posture relaxing slightly. "I need to see Leo." Cole's voice was flat, professional. Dominic checked his gold Rolex, a condescending smirk pulling at his lips. "It's late, sweetheart. The boss is going over the quarterly cash flow. Why don't you go back to counting paper clips?" Cole didn't look at Dominic. He kept his eyes on Thomas. "Thomas, if I don't walk through those doors in the next 10 seconds, a federal RICO investigation is going to gut this company by Christmas. Open the door." Dominic scoffed, stepping into his path. "Listen here, you little." "Let him in." The voice came through the heavy oak. Low, gravelly, absolute. Thomas smoothly stepped in front of Dominic, placing a massive hand on the lieutenant's chest, and opened the door for Cole. Leo was at the head of the conference table, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. The table was covered in ledgers and blueprints. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his gray eyes stark in the harsh overhead light. But the moment Cole walked in, his entire physical focus shifted. The tension in his jaw softened. "I found a blind spot." Cole walked straight to the table, not waiting for permission. He dropped the open folder over Leo's ledgers. Leo didn't look at the papers. He looked at Cole. "You're here late." Route 44. Cole tapped the spreadsheet with a manicured fingernail. "It's supposed to be hauling Italian silk and raw cotton. High volume, low weight. But look at the fuel consumption over the last 4 transatlantic crossings." Leo finally dropped his gaze to the numbers. His mind was sharp. He saw the discrepancy almost immediately. A faint, dangerous crease formed between his brows. "The fuel burn implies a massive weight increase," Cole said, his voice dropping into the cold, clinical register he used when dismantling a broken system. "Someone is piggybacking on your legitimate manifest. They're loading something heavy, machinery, munitions, gold bullion, I don't know. But they're using your ships to move it, and they're hiding the weight by falsifying the displacement drafts at the port of origin." The room grew terrifyingly quiet. The air pressure seemed to drop. Leo traced the column of numbers with his index finger. "Who signed off on the loading manifest in Naples?" Cole flipped to the second page. "Dominic." The silence shattered. The conference room doors slammed open. Dominic stood in the threshold, his face flushed red, his hand hovering dangerously close to the inside of his suit jacket. Thomas was right behind him, a suppressed pistol already drawn and pointed squarely at the base of Dominic's skull. "She's lying." Dominic spat, his eyes darting frantically from Leo to Cole. He's a glorified secretary, Leo. He doesn't know how the old world works. You're going to take the word of some civilian over a made man. Leo didn't shout. He didn't even stand up. He just leaned back in his leather chair, the picture of lethal composure. He isn't a civilian, Dominic. He's the only reason you aren't currently being indicted by the DEA for trafficking unauthorized weapons on my ships. Cole felt a jolt of shock. Weapons. The heavy cargo was weapons. Dominic's face lost all its color. He knew the math didn't lie, and he knew Leo had just done the math. The lieutenant made a fatal miscalculation. He panicked. He lunged forward, bypassing Leo, aiming straight for the weakest target in the room. He grabbed Cole by the upper arm, hauling him backward and yanking a snub-nosed revolver from his jacket, pressing the barrel hard against Cole's ribs. Back off! Dominic screamed, his composure entirely dissolved. Thomas, drop the gun, or I blow a hole through his spine. Cole didn't scream. He didn't freeze. The Omega who had cowered in front of Marcus Webb was dead. He looked down at Dominic's hand on his arm, felt the cold steel digging into his side, and then looked across the table at Leo. Leo Costello had stopped breathing. The quiet, controlled CEO vanished entirely. In his place was the apex predator of the Boston underworld. The sheer, unadulterated violence radiating from his eyes was blinding. Dominic. Leo's voice was a sound that belonged in a nightmare. Take the gun away from his ribs. I'm walking out of here, Leo. Dominic panted, dragging Cole backward toward the glass walls. I'm taking him to the elevator, and I'm gone. You try to stop me, I'll drop him. You underestimate him, Leo said softly. Cole didn't need another cue. He didn't wait to be rescued. Dominic was focused entirely on Leo and Thomas, expecting an external threat. He wasn't paying attention to the logistics director. Cole slammed his heavy 3-inch stiletto heel down with all his weight, driving the metal spike directly through the leather of Dominic's shoe and into the fragile bones of his instep. A sickening crunch echoed in the room. Dominic howled, his grip on Cole's arm slackening for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Leo needed. Leo vaulted the heavy mahogany table with terrifying speed. Before Dominic could raise the gun, Leo's hand clamped around the cylinder of the revolver, preventing it from rotating. With his other hand, Leo struck Dominic in the throat, a precise, devastating blow. Dominic dropped the gun and collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his ruined foot and his crushed windpipe. Thomas stepped forward seamlessly, kicking the revolver across the carpet and dragging Dominic up by the collar of his expensive suit. Take him downstairs, Leo said, his chest heaving slightly. He didn't look at the traitor. Find out who paid him to move the guns. Then make him disappear. Yes, boss. Thomas grunted, dragging the wheezing man out of the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The silence rushed back in, thick and heavy with adrenaline. Cole stood by the glass window, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged breaths. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow tremor in his hands. He'd just assaulted a Mafia hitman. He'd just watched a man get condemned to death. He expected to feel horror. He expected the crushing weight of guilt. Instead, he felt an electric, terrifying sense of clarity. The world was brutal. It was entirely unforgiving. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't the prey. A sudden sharp sound broke his reverie, a heavy drop of liquid hitting the mahogany table. He turned. Leo was leaning heavily against the edge of the table, his head bowed. Blood was dripping from his left hand, pooling on the polished wood. When he'd grabbed the cylinder of the revolver, the sharp metal of the sight had sliced a deep, ragged gash across his palm. You're bleeding. Cole's voice was oddly steady in the quiet room. Leo looked down at his hand as if it belonged to someone else. It's nothing. Superficial. He reached into his pocket for a handkerchief, but his fingers were slick and he fumbled. Cole crossed the room. He didn't ask for permission. He reached out and took Leo's injured hand in his. His skin was burning hot, calloused and rough, slick with bright red blood. The contrast of his dark violence and the vulnerability of the open wound struck Ethan deeply. Sit down. It was an order. Leo looked at him, his pale gray eyes searching his face. He was looking for the terror, the disgust that normal people felt when the curtain was pulled back on his world. He didn't find it. He slowly sank into a nearby leather chair. Cole walked over to the executive bar in the corner, bypassing the scotch, grabbing a clean linen towel, a bottle of clear vodka, and the small first aid kit kept under the counter. He returned and knelt on the floor between Leo's parted knees. "This is going to burn," he said flatly. "I'm aware." Leo didn't brace himself. He just watched. Cole poured the vodka directly over the gash. Leo didn't flinch, not a muscle in his face twitched. He was completely focused on the way Cole's hands moved. Efficient, careful, surprisingly gentle. Cole dried the wound with the linen cloth, his thumb pressing against Leo's pulse point to steady his hand. Leo's heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm, completely at odds with the violence that had just occurred. "You didn't freeze," Leo said quietly, the gravel in his voice scraping against the quiet room. Cole unrolled a sterile bandage. "I told you, Leo. I'm not a rescue dog. I know how to survive. Surviving is hiding." Leo leaned forward slightly. The proximity was intoxicating. He smelled like gunpowder, copper, and expensive cologne. "You didn't hide. You fought back. You broke his foot. He was ruining my supply chain." Cole wrapped the gauze tightly around Leo's palm. A deflection. A cynical shield thrown up to hide the fact that his hands were shaking. Leo reached out with his uninjured hand. He didn't grab Cole. He simply placed 2 fingers under his chin, applying a feather-light pressure, tilting his face up to meet his gaze. "Stop." The command wasn't about the bandage. It was about the armor. "You saved my empire tonight," Leo said, his eyes locking onto Cole's with an intensity that made the air evaporate from his lungs. "My best men missed the anomaly. They looked at the ships and saw cargo. You looked at a spreadsheet and saw a ghost. You dismantled a threat that would have put me in a federal penitentiary." Cole swallowed hard, the knot in his throat suddenly massive. "It's my job. Your job is logistics." Leo's thumb brushed against Cole's lower lip. The touch was electric, sending a sharp thrill down his spine. "What you did tonight was loyalty. I don't belong in this world, Leo." Cole's cynical defenses were crumbling under the weight of Leo's stare. "I'm a guy from Southie who clips coupons and yells at truckers. You run the city. You run the machine that keeps the city moving." Leo leaned closer. "You think I want someone who belongs in this world? I am surrounded by murderers, thieves, and liars. I live in the dark, Ethan. You are the only person who looks at me and sees something worth fixing." He dropped his hand from Cole's chin and cupped the side of his face. The warmth of his palm, the slight roughness of his skin, was an anchor. "I told you the day you walked into this office," Leo murmured, his lips a breath away from Cole's. "You are out of bounds. No one touches you. Dominic broke that rule. He is going to die for it. And I don't feel a shred of remorse." The raw, unvarnished truth of his confession shattered the last wall between them. He wasn't pretending to be a good man. He was offering Cole exactly what he was, a monster, entirely devoted to keeping him safe. Cole leaned into the touch. He closed his eyes, the exhaustion of fighting the world alone finally breaking him. "Then don't let them touch me," he whispered. Leo let out a ragged breath. He closed the distance, capturing Cole's lips in a kiss that was entirely devoid of hesitation. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, heavy, and intensely possessive. It felt like a claiming. Cole didn't pull away. He grabbed the lapels of Leo's ruined shirt, pulling him closer, kissing him back with a fierce, answering heat. The sterile, cold environment of the boardroom melted away, replaced by the overwhelming reality of the man in front of him. When they finally broke apart, the silence in the room felt different. It was no longer heavy with adrenaline. It was thick with a new, terrifying permanence. Leo rested his forehead against Cole's. "You're bleeding." Cole blinked, confused. He looked down. The side of his white silk blouse was stained with a small patch of red. Dominic's gun sight had caught him when he'd stomped on his foot. He hadn't even felt it. "It's just a scratch," he said dismissively. Leo's eyes darkened, the silver in his irises flashing dangerously. He stood up, pulling Cole to his feet with him. He didn't let go of his hand. Come on. Leo's voice left no room for argument. Where are we going? My penthouse. Leo hit a button on his desk, summoning his private elevator. I'm cleaning that cut. And then you are going to sleep. I will handle the rest of the garbage in this company. Cole looked at the mess on the conference table. The blood, the ledgers, the discarded gun. A few hours ago, he would have panicked. He would have calculated the cost, the risk, the potential for ruin. Now he just looked at Leo, saw the absolute certainty in his eyes. Okay, he said simply. The penthouse was exactly what Cole expected, and yet entirely surprising. It occupied the top 2 floors of a luxury high-rise overlooking the Charles River. It was vast, silent, and decorated in stark, minimalist tones of charcoal and slate. But there were signs of humanity scattered throughout. A half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen island, a stack of worn history books on the coffee table, a vinyl record player sitting next to an impressive collection of jazz albums. It was the home of a man who craved quiet. Leo led Cole into a massive, marble-tiled bathroom. He sat him on the edge of the sunken tub and retrieved a first aid kit that made the one in the office look like a toy. He didn't speak as he worked. He carefully unbuttoned the side of Cole's ruined silk blouse, his knuckles gently grazing his skin. The touch was agonizingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he was capable of inflicting. He cleaned the shallow scratch on Cole's ribs with antiseptic, his jaw clenched tight. It really is just a scratch, Leo. Cole's voice was barely a whisper. A man put a gun to you. Leo's voice was a rasp. He taped a piece of gauze over the cut, his fingers lingering on Cole's waist. I watched a man hold a weapon against your ribs. And for 3 seconds, I didn't know how to guarantee your survival. I have never been powerless in my entire life. I hated it. He looked up at Cole, the mask of the untouchable Mafia Don completely gone. He looked exhausted. Haunted. You weren't powerless, Cole said, reaching out to touch the faint scar above Leo's eyebrow. You stopped him. You stopped him. A faint, dark smile touched the corners of Leo's mouth. You put a stiletto through his foot. I think I'm slightly terrified of you, Ethan. Good. Cole breathed. You should be. I manage your spreadsheets. I know exactly how much you spend on dry cleaning. Leo let out a low, rough laugh, the sound vibrating against Cole's palms. He leaned his face into Cole's hands, closing his eyes for a moment. It was a gesture of complete, uncharacteristic surrender. The man who ruled the city with an iron fist was actively seeking comfort from the Omega, who balanced his books. What happens tomorrow? Cole asked, the logistical side of his brain refusing to completely shut down. The weapons on Route 44. The people Dominic was working for. They're going to realize their shipment isn't coming. Leo opened his eyes. The softness vanished, replaced by cold, calculating steel. Tomorrow, I send a message. The weapons will be dumped into the Atlantic. The people who bought Dominic will receive his Rolex in the mail, covered in his blood. And they will learn that Apex Global is no longer vulnerable. He stood up, offering Cole his uninjured hand. But that is tomorrow's war. He pulled Cole up against his chest. Tonight, you are going to sleep in my bed. And I am going to stand outside the door if I have to make sure you know you are safe. Cole looked at him. The cynical Omega from Southie would have bolted. He would have called an Uber and run back to the leaking faucet and the crushing debt, preferring the devil he knew. But Cole wasn't that man anymore. He'd walked through the fire, and he'd found a man who didn't want to burn him. He wanted to watch the world burn for him. You don't have to stand outside the door, Leo. Cole's hand slid up Leo's chest to wrap around his neck. Leo's breath hitched. His arms banded around Cole's waist, pulling him flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of Cole's neck, inhaling deeply, as if drawing his life force directly from his skin. Are you sure? Leo's voice was muffled against Cole's collarbone. Once you cross this line, Ethan, I won't let you go. I will give you anything you want. I will burn down anyone who looks at you wrong. But I will not let you walk away. It was a warning. It was a promise of total, inescapable possession. I'm not going anywhere, Cole answered, pressing a kiss to the side of Leo's jaw. Someone has to fix your fuel efficiency ratios. In the dark, quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, high above the dirty, violent city, Leo Costello finally stopped fighting the war in his head. He picked Cole up, his legs wrapping instinctively around his waist, and carried him into the bedroom. The transition was complete. He'd started as a victim, a casualty of a broken system run by men like Webb, who rumor had it was currently managing a rat-infested basement warehouse for a rival company, jumping at shadows and drinking himself to death. He'd become the director, the anchor, the bleeding edge of Leo Costello's empire. He didn't need a fairy tale. He had reality. And the reality was that the most dangerous alpha in Boston belonged entirely to him. Leo laid Cole down on the massive bed, the silk sheets cool against his bare skin. He hovered over him, his gray eyes dark with something that looked almost like reverence. "You have no idea what you do to me," Leo murmured, his voice rough. "The first time I saw you, I knew. I knew you were going to be the death of me." "Death of you?" Cole arched an eyebrow, a ghost of his cynical humor returning. "I thought I was the one who was supposed to be the damsel in distress." "You were never a damsel in distress." Leo's lips curved into a dark smile. "You were a wolf in sheep's clothing, and you just didn't know it yet." He lowered his head, pressing a kiss to the spot just below Cole's ear, the scent gland that was normally covered by blockers. Cole gasped, his body arching involuntarily. The sensation was electric, the intimacy of it overwhelming. "You're not wearing blockers," Leo observed, his voice a low growl. "I've been smelling you all night. It's been driving me insane." Cole's breath hitched. He'd forgotten. He'd been so focused on the crisis, the adrenaline, the panic, he'd forgotten to reapply his scent blockers. His natural omega scent was permeating the air around them, sweet and warm and utterly intoxicating. Cole started. "Don't apologize." Leo pressed another kiss to his throat, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin. "I've been imagining what you'd smell like for weeks. He broke off, his voice thick. "I never thought I'd get to know." Cole's hands fisted in Leo's hair, pulling him closer. "Then stop imagining," he said breathlessly. "Stop imagining and know." Leo groaned, his control finally shattering. He kissed Cole with a ferocity that stole the breath from his lungs, his hands roaming over his body, mapping every curve and playing. Cole responded in kind, his fingers working at the buttons of Leo's ruined shirt, desperate to feel skin against skin. The kiss was raw, claiming, a promise and a possession all at once. When Leo finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard, the air between them charged with something primal and undeniable. "Ethan," Leo's voice was a rasp. "I need you to know, this isn't just, I don't do this. I don't bring people here. I don't. I know." Cole reached up, cupping Leo's face in his hands. "I know, Leo. I've been watching you too. I've been waiting for you to stop pretending." Leo's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like vulnerability. "I'm not a good man." "I know," Cole repeated, a small, wry smile curving his lips. "I balance your books. I've seen the money. I know exactly what kind of man you are. And you're still here?" "I'm still here." Cole pulled Leo down, their foreheads touching. "I'm not afraid of you, Leo. I'm afraid of what it means that I want you anyway." Leo made a sound low in his throat, something between a growl and a groan. "Christ, Ethan, you're going to destroy me." "That's the plan," Cole murmured, and kissed him again. Later, when the city lights painted stripes across the ceiling and Cole lay with his head on Leo's chest, listening to the steady, heavy rhythm of his heart, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Safe. It was a foreign sensation, one that he'd almost forgotten existed. For so long, survival had meant staying vigilant, staying one step ahead, never letting his guard down. But here, in the arms of the most dangerous man in Boston, he felt something that terrified him more than any threat ever had. Peace. Leo's hand was tangled in his hair, his fingers tracing lazy patterns across his scalp. His other hand rested on Cole's hip, a possessive weight that was somehow grounding rather than oppressive. "Tell me something," Cole said, his voice sleepy and muffled against Leo's chest. "Anything. Your scar." Cole traced the pale line above Leo's eyebrow. "How did you get it?" Leo was quiet for a moment. "I was 17. Street fight. Took a broken bottle to the face because I wouldn't let some alpha take advantage of an Omega kid I didn't even know." Cole looked up, surprised. "You fought for a stranger?" "I fought because it was the right thing to do." Leo's voice was matter-of-fact. "The kid was scared, alone, and everyone else just watched. I couldn't do that. I couldn't just watch." Cole pressed a kiss to the scar, a gesture of profound tenderness. "You've always been like this, haven't you? Picking up strays and fixing broken things." Leo's hand tightened in Cole's hair. "Don't call yourself a stray." "I'm not." Cole smiled against his skin. "I'm yours. There's a difference." Leo went very still. Then, slowly, he rolled them both over, pinning Cole to the mattress with a weight that was more protective than threatening. He looked down at him with something fierce and vulnerable in his eyes. "You mean that?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper. Cole reached up, cradling Leo's face in his hands. "I've never meant anything more in my life." Leo kissed him again, soft and slow, and when he pulled back, the mask was gone entirely. There was nothing but raw, unguarded emotion in his eyes. "I love you," Leo said, the words falling out like they'd been waiting for years. "I know it's too soon. I know it's insane. But I've been in love with you since the first time I watched you unjam that copy machine. You didn't even know I was there. And you were so gentle with it. With everything. With the world. You were drowning and you were still gentle. And I thought. He broke off, his jaw tight, and Cole pulled him down into an embrace. "I love you too," Cole whispered into his ear. "I think I've loved you since you put that cup of tea on my desk. You didn't even ask. You just saw me. I've always seen you, Ethan." Leo buried his face in Cole's neck, breathing him in. "I just didn't know if you'd ever let me show it." Cole held him tighter, feeling the weight of the man above him. The power, the danger, the absolute devotion. "Show me," Cole said softly. "Show me every day for the rest of my life." Leo laughed, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through Cole's entire body. "That's a long time to be stuck with me." "Good thing I'm planning on it," Cole replied, and kissed him until neither of them could remember what they'd been so afraid of. The next morning, Cole woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain against the windows. He was alone in the massive bed, but the sheets next to him were still warm. He stretched, every muscle in his body pleasantly sore, and sat up. Leo was in the kitchen, standing at the island in nothing but low-slung pajama pants. His back was a map of scars, old, faded marks that told stories Cole didn't yet know. He was making coffee, his movements economical and precise. Cole padded out of the bedroom, still naked, and wrapped his arms around Leo from behind. Leo leaned back into him, a soft sound of contentment escaping his lips. "Morning," Leo murmured. "Morning." Cole pressed a kiss to the back of his shoulder. "Did you sleep?" "Some." Leo turned, pulling Cole into his arms. You? You were dead to the world for about 6 hours. Best sleep I've had in years." Cole tilted his head up, meeting Leo's gaze. "What time is it?" "Just past 9. Arthur's downstairs whenever you're ready." "But," Leo's hands tightened on Cole's waist. "You don't have to go in today, or ever, if you don't want to." Cole laughed softly. "And let you run the logistics department alone? You'd have a fuel crisis by the end of the week." "Probably," Leo admitted, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "I'm better at destroying things than managing them." "You're better at a lot of things," Cole said, pulling him down for a kiss. They stood there in the kitchen, wrapped in each other, as the rain fell on the windows and the city hummed below them. It was peaceful in a way Cole had never expected to find, in a way he'd never allowed himself to hope for. When they finally broke apart, Leo pressed his forehead to Cole's. "I have to deal with the fallout from last night. Dominic's people, the weapons, the audit that's going to come down on us if we're not careful." "I'll help," Cole said immediately. I found the problem. I can help fix it. I know you can. Leo's voice was soft. But you don't have to. You've already done more than anyone else in this organization has managed in years. I want to. Cole met his eyes. I'm not just going to sit on the sidelines, Leo. If I'm going to be yours, I'm going to be all in. That means the good and the bad. The spreadsheets and he gestured vaguely. The other stuff. Leo laughed, a genuine sound. The other stuff. Very professional. I'm a logistics director, not a hitman, Cole said dryly. My vocabulary doesn't include the words for whatever it is you do. No, Leo agreed, pulling him closer. It doesn't, and I'd like to keep it that way. Cole kissed him, soft and reassuring. I know what you are, Leo. I've always known. It doesn't change anything. I don't deserve you. Maybe not. Cole's smile was wry. But you've got me anyway, so you'd better make the most of it. Leo kissed him again, deeper this time, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. I'll get dressed, Cole said, untangling himself from Leo's arms. We've got an empire to save. The empire can wait 5 more minutes, Leo said, pulling him back. Cole laughed, letting himself be drawn back into the warmth of Leo's arms. The fight, the war, was still waiting for them. The weapons, the traitors, the enemies who would inevitably come for what Leo had built. But for now, in this quiet moment, there was just the two of them. And that was more than Cole had ever dared to dream. The morning sun was a cold, watery thing as Ethan Cole stepped out of the penthouse elevator, Leo's hand warm on the small of his back. Arthur was waiting by the SUV, his face impassive as always. Mr. Cole. Mr. Costello. Arthur opened the rear door. Thank you, Arthur. Cole slid in, Leo following close behind. As the SUV pulled away from the curb and into the gray Boston morning, Cole looked out the window at the city sliding by. It looked the same as it always had, cold, unforgiving, full of sharp edges and hidden dangers. But somehow, it felt different now. He felt different. Leo's hand found his, fingers interlacing. Cole looked over at him. The sharp jaw, the pale eyes, the scars that told stories of violence and survival. The most dangerous alpha in Boston, holding his hand like Cole was the only thing in the world worth protecting. You're staring, Leo said, not looking away from the window. You're beautiful, Cole replied, and watched Leo's cheeks flush just slightly. You're insufferable, Leo muttered. And yet, Cole squeezed his hand. You love me. Leo turned to look at him then, his gray eyes warm. Yeah, he said softly. I do. I really, really do. Cole leaned over, pressing a kiss to his cheek. Good. Because I'm not going anywhere. He meant it. The cynicism, the fear, the constant calculation of risk versus reward. It was all still there, buried beneath the surface. But for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole felt something stronger. Hope. And with Leo Costello at his side, he was ready to face whatever came next,